ahead, Mama. Yeah.
I was still
and I mistook you. At least from all the way across. Well,
hi everybody. All right, so we're going to start. Can people hear me? Okay, we're starting panel 3, the disability law and policy. Got a really fabulous panel of speakers. I'm your moderator today. I'm Scholin. I was last year's president of NALSWD. Now work for the Department of Labor in San Francisco. And on to the important people. Introduce yourself just briefly, so people know what they're talking about. Then we'll go down and everybody will start talking and say a few words about their ideas.
Good afternoon. I am Kareem Dale, and I'm Special Assistant to the President for Disability Policy. I work at the White House, and I sit in 2 offices at the White House. I sit in the Office of Public Engagement, which is one of Valerie Jarrett's offices. In that office, I do all of the outreach to the disability community, making sure that we know what the community wants us to be doing, and then making sure that we're communicating what the President is doing related to disability. I also sit in the Domestic Policy Council on the senior staff. And out of that office is where I coordinate all of the disability policy for all of the federal government out of the White House. So in that capacity, any sort of legislation, executive branch actions, presidential memorandum, executive orders, rulemakings, budgeting, anything like that, I coordinate as it relates to disability policy. That's disability-only stuff, and then there's also broader pieces of legislation or executive branch actions where there may be a little bit of a piece of it that includes disability. I'm involved in that as well.
And hi, I'm Andy Imparato. Can folks in the back hear me okay? I work for Senator Tom Harkin from Iowa on the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, which is a committee that deals with K through 12 education, higher education, workforce development, vocational rehabilitation, assistive technology, and a lot of
just a little small area.
A lot of issues that we care about. I'm a disability rights lawyer. Went to Stanford, graduated in 1990. I have bipolar disorder myself, and I've been open about it throughout my career. And before coming back to work for Senator Harkin, this is my second tour with him. I was running a membership organization in D.C. called the American Association of People with Disabilities for 11 years. So it's good to be with you all. I think this is my 4th or 5th NALSWD gathering, and it's fun to see it grow.
You know what? I should say before Ronza goes, I should add, Andy made me think that I should add that I also am a lawyer, and I went to University of Illinois, graduated from law school with my MBA and law degree from there. Practiced law in Chicago for 8 years before I was drafted to come down to D.C. So, and I'm blind.
Hello, I'm Ronza Othman. I currently work for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and the EEO office. We handle civil rights and EEO complaints. I manage the EEO complaint process on the formal and the informal side, so employees and applicants and retirees who are complaining about discrimination, filing complaints with our agency about, concerning discrimination for all types of reasons. I handle those types of cases. Prior to that, I was the agency's disability employment program manager and worked on disability employment program type initiatives agency-wide, everything from emergency notification systems and evacuation to the most interesting email that I've ever sent out to the agency, I think, in my life when I was encouraging everybody to please go and test the new ADA type flush mechanisms in the bathrooms. Prior to joining Department of Health and Human Services, I worked for the Department of Homeland Security in their civil rights office, working on a number of things, related to engagement in countering violent extremism, counterterrorism, but we also worked on post-Katrina issues with regards to populations of individuals with disabilities. So a lot of disability preparedness and recovery type efforts. I also currently serve as the first vice president of the National Association of Blind Lawyers. I'm blind, in case the title didn't give that away. And I'm an attorney originally from Chicago, where I practiced in various fields within the profession, everything from criminal prosecution to disability law, to employment law, to immigration law, and so on and so on. I worked at a big firm. I was a solo practitioner. I worked for pretty much every state agency in Illinois, I think. I have a law degree from DePaul University College of Law, as well as a master's degree in government and nonprofit administration, and bachelor's degrees in biology and in philosophy from St. Xavier University in Chicago.
Fabulous. So as you can see, we've got a super panel here today. All of you have worked both in, sort of a litigation or being a more traditional law role, and now have moved on to policy. Can you talk a little bit about how you can achieve different things, what you can do in your role in setting policy for law? Yep. Anybody who wants to start?
Setting policy through law. Well, that's a huge area. I actually, when I was practicing law, I did not do disability law. I did general commercial litigation at Winston. Then I had my own firm for a couple of years where I did personal injury. But I think that one of the reasons that I came down here when the president asked me to join the team was that I thought that we could make a real difference. And we had a great start during the campaign. And I was just telling my colleague Sarah, who was with me, that I did this conference during the campaign, and we had a great time. Like, went out partying after the conference and hung out, and it was a great time. But we really felt like we could come and make a real difference and really improve the lives of folks with disabilities, working with people with disabilities. And I think we've really started to do that, and we've made some inroads. So, I think the biggest thing that we try to do is to pass policies that are helping people on the ground and that people can use as tools. My big thing when I go around and talk to people is like, I'm not interested in just listing a bunch of accomplishments that we've done for the sake of them, but I want you to understand when I list an accomplishment, it's a tool that you can use on the ground. So let me give just one example, and this is what people would say is a minor policy that we passed, but it's a good example of how you can use it on the ground. We put out a Dear Colleague letter about technology in colleges and universities, as well as K through 12, saying basically that if you're going to use accessible technology, if you're going to use technology in your school, it's got to be accessible. And it's one of those things that like you don't think much about, but people have already told me like they take that and take it to their college and say, hey, wait a minute, you're using this piece of technology that's not accessible. Here's the letter that the Department of Education put out and the Office of Civil Rights and the Department of Justice put out. And it's something you can use at your college right away on the ground. And that letter scares people, and that's what it's designed to do, to let them know that if you're doing something wrong, if you have a curriculum that's online that's not accessible, or if you're holding a meeting or a class in some place that's not accessible, any sort of technology that you're using, it's got to be accessible. So what we try to do is put into place policies that are helping people on the ground, whether it's in employment, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's in education. That's what we've tried to do, and that's just a broad swath. I'm sure I'll have a chance to talk about more specifics later.
So when I was in law school, I didn't study public policy very much. I didn't study disability issues. I didn't take administrative law, but I kind of developed a stronger political identity, and I had a sense that I wanted to use my law degree to try to improve equality broadly in the country. And it was only kind of after I graduated that I kind of learned about policy and how to use law. My first job after clerking for a judge for a year was I did a fellowship at the Disability Law Center in Boston, and we were doing advocacy around SSI and Medicaid, and I was representing individual clients, but I was also particularly on the Medicaid side, we had a state Medicaid director that was trying to impose managed care. It was one of the first states that went to managed care, and they were trying to cut back on personal care assistance services, and I ended up working with a coalition trying to fight against that, both through litigation and through legislative advocacy and using the media and just community organizing. And I found that I enjoyed the legislative advocacy. I pulled my first all-nighter in the context of the Massachusetts legislature. They stay up all night and cut a lot of deals when they do their state budget. And I guess that's not that unusual for state legislatures, but I'm not somebody who functions very well at 3 o'clock in the morning, but I got tapped to stay up all night because we had an issue that we were working on, and it was fun. So when I came to Washington, I went to work for Senator Harkin on the Senate Subcommittee on Disability Policy, which doesn't exist anymore. The subcommittee of the committee that I currently work for, which Senator Harkin is now the chair of. But for me, I like doing policy work because in my individual client representation, I kept seeing systemic issues that weren't getting addressed, and I was attracted to trying to make a change in the policy so that we wouldn't have the problems on the ground in the same way in the individual cases, like cutting hours to personal care attendant services. You can either represent each client and push against that and try to differentiate your client from the bad policy, or you could advocate to change the bad policy. The other thing that I came to appreciate when I was doing the policy work in Massachusetts and then when I came to DC is policy is a tool for organizing the community, and sometimes lawyers and other advocates focus a lot on trying to win on a particular policy, and what I've tried to do is focus more on using policy fights to be better organized after the fight is over than we were before it started. So that's just another aspect of policy that I find kind of movement building and interesting.
My work in the policy arena, at least in the most recent few years, has been sort of to sandwich what these two guys do. On the one hand, when I'm wearing my hat with the nonprofits that I work with, we're actually trying to convince them that the policies that we want to see implemented and enacted in some cases really ought to be. So we're trying to, through advocacy, through outreach, through education on the Hill and at the White House, and fortunately for us, both of these two gentlemen's bosses have been very receptive to a lot of the work that we've been trying to accomplish. Education is huge, and that's really starts at the grassroots level. That's where you guys are. That's where you come in. And you really have the ability to shape what the policies look like. So when you call that congressman and say, hey, this law or this bill or this policy or this idea that I have or that you guys are working on has these as positives or these, A, B, and C as negatives, they actually, you would hope, and in most cases they actually do, hear you. So if you're not involved, you can't really drive the policy. On the other hand, in my job, we're trying to implement and adhere to the policies that actually do come out from either headquarters for us or from the White House or from Congress through statutes or whatever the case may be. We're implementing EEOC regulations in our case, and that has its challenges sometimes, especially when there are certain areas that don't clearly define what's expected. And we need to work hard to find a way to put those policies into place and to make them meaningful for us. An example is Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act. And that has been very challenging to figure out, what does this mean? What font size should we be using? What font color, style, all that? What types of formatting and things along those lines? Well, we agree with the driving force behind it. We agree that, yes, absolutely, everybody who has a disability should be able to access the same types of materials, the same types at the same time as everybody else. who doesn't have a disability. But then when you're looking at actually finding a way to make that meaningful when you're not getting clear guidance, we can be creative, but it also allows for some people to be lazy and either not do it at all or just do the bare minimum. So one of the things that we actually did in my office is we've made our complaints process 508 compliant. So if you want to file a complaint for violations to Section 508, you can actually do that in a manner that is accessible. That sounds ridiculous, right? Like, you really? This is something that we're proud of? Absolutely, we're proud of it, because it's one of those things that if somebody hadn't called and said, hey, I need this to happen, you guys need to really develop policies and develop protocols that make it possible for me to access this material. Because the reality is that there's such a wide scope in the world of things that we ought to be doing. We know we ought to be doing them, but when we're prioritizing, unless there's actual feet on the ground, people reminding us and the federal government and the advocacy organizations, these are what we want your priorities to be, then the squeaky wheel gets the grease. So I'm throwing it back at you guys. You drive policy. We just implement it.
I think that's actually a great transition to my next question. I wanted each of you to just name a couple of your policy goals you're really passionate about right now. Things you're aiming for.
I don't have to start every time.
I'm happy to start. The thing that Senator Harkin is very focused on right now is trying to move the employment rate for people with disabilities up. This is something that a number of us have been frustrated about for a long time. We don't have perfect data around labor force participation for people with disabilities, but based on all of the data sets that we've seen, that we don't have any evidence that the employment rates for people with disabilities have gone up since the ADA passed in 1990. And we now have better monthly data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics going back to 2008. And just based on that data, it looks like people with disabilities have been disproportionately negatively impacted by the economic downturn in terms of labor force participation. So we're really trying. Senator Harkin set a goal last April to try to get the labor force number up from 4.9 million, where it was in April, to 6 million by 2015. The highest it's been since we started collecting it on a monthly basis was about close to 5.8 million back in 2008 before the downturn really hit. So we're trying to make up that ground and then go a little bit further. He's doing a summit with some business leaders in June to try to get them to make some public commitments like Walgreens has done. Walgreens has committed 10% of their employees across the country would be people with disabilities. As a goal, the Department of Labor has what we see as a really strong rule trying to get federal contractors to set goals and to take this more seriously as part of their responsibilities under the Rehab Act. So that's an issue that we're working on, and we see it as a good connector across disability issue. A lot of other things have to work in order for employment to work, so we see it as a good ultimate indicator of how our public policy is working for people with disability.
From the perspective of the agency, I think we're looking to increase certainly the hiring and retention and promotion. So the three areas really, not just the hiring, but also the promotion and retention. So we want to get them, we want to promote them, and we want to keep them. The statistics tend to suggest that when hiring does tend to increase, that retention doesn't correlate. Promotion doesn't correlate. So that's something that we're working on. We're also working on, in my agency specifically, reducing the amount of time spent to provide reasonable accommodations, because the faster the reasonable accommodations are given and approved and provided, the faster an individual with a disability is going to be able to get to their job and do well at it. From National Association of Blind Lawyers perspective, we're looking at trying to accomplish increased access, whether it be through technology, it be through information, Technology's huge right now, especially in the educational systems. People have mentioned, Kareem specifically has mentioned that letter, which is absolutely critical. Technology is increasing, and the populations of individuals with disabilities in this country need to be behind the scenes and involved with the development of that technology, as opposed to it being remedied later on. Let's actually start by having it accessible. So that's something that's huge, as well as just dealing with discrimination across the board, whether it be through parents. There's still states, there's still areas in this country where a parent with a disability might have the welfare office, their local welfare office, literally come in and evaluate them simply because they have a disability. That is not okay. So various areas, whether from employment, through education, through just being able to raise your kids. Those are the areas that we're focusing on, and those are our strategic goals.
I work on dozens of policies, so it's too hard to come up with two, so I'm going to give you a few. You've heard each panelist talk about employment, so that's obviously something that's very important. And the biggest employment thing that we have going right now, Andy mentioned, is Section 503. We put out the NPRM, the comment period is closed. Does everybody know what Section 503 is? Not really? No? Okay, all right. So Section 503 is basically the rule that says that if you are a federal contractor, if you're a private business and you're doing business with the federal government, you're considered a federal contractor, you need to be hiring people with disabilities. There's been rules for minorities and women and people with disabilities, but the difference is that for minorities and women, they've had goals, certain percentage goals. There's never been any goals, though, for people with disabilities. So we put out a proposed rule to change that, to set a national goal. We proposed a 7% national goal. We also proposed a whole bunch of other things beyond the goal, such as making sure they're consulting with advocacy organizations, working with the rehab, Voc Rehab, and all sorts of other things for accountability and responsibility. And so we're working on the final rule now, and when that rule, that will be a game changer, really close to on par with the ADA as it specifically relates to employment. The ADA obviously did a lot more, but as it relates to employment, this will be the biggest thing maybe that we've ever done as a country for employment of people with disabilities. So we're excited about that. It's going to affect each and every one of you all in this room. The other thing that I'm really excited about is Section 508. You heard Ronza mention that. We're going to be coming out. Last year, the president said that he would be coming out with a strategic plan, said that we as an administration would be coming out with one. And we're close to being able to post that up and start the process. And what we're going to do is we're going to really put up a beginning plan because we want to make sure that we get everybody's input. And we've already talked to everybody under the sun. We've talked to advocates, we've talked to Section 508 coordinators, we've talked to technology experts, we've talked to disability technology experts, we've talked to everybody. And so we're going to come out with a real streamlined, real direct, kind of nuts and bolts type of plan, and we're going to get everybody. We want everybody to comment on it, and we're gonna get comments on it, and then we're going to come out with a final plan with an action plan as well. So we're excited about tackling 508 because 12 years afterwards, it's time to make some progress on 508. The other couple of things that I'm really excited about is in the Department of Transportation has a number of rules coming out. One of them that we're going to bring the final rule is the rule about saying that travel agency and airline websites and all have to be accessible, and then also the kiosks at the airlines have to be accessible, or a certain percentage of those kiosks need to be to make sure that they're accessible for people with disabilities. And so we're working on that final rule along with a number of others. And then finally, one of the other things I'm really excited about is everything that the Department of Justice is doing. This is obviously this is a civil rights issue for people with disabilities, and our Department of Justice has been really one of our bellwether agencies looking at these issues, and everything they're doing from Olmstead to looking at movie captioning rules to looking at making sure the internet is accessible. We've got a lot of things in the works, and we're hoping that we're going to be able to finalize those and implement those in the in the next couple of 2, 3, 4 years.
Great. Do you have any questions from students? policy and the things they're doing here.
Well, you all have such interesting jobs. I wonder if you could say maybe one, it might be hard to pick, but if you have one experience that is maybe the most exciting that you've had, or maybe the best achievement that you think you've had while at your job.
So we had a question about policy achievements and things people have already done at their job.
That wasn't the question. She said, what was the most exciting thing that may have happened at your job? That's a fair, yeah. She's trying to make it like policy. All right, I'm gonna give you something that's not policy. You know, we're gonna talk a lot about policy. I'll give you something that's not policy. You know, particularly the job that Andy and I have, you know, you get a lot of really cool experiences, and when you meet a lot of cool people. I'm not as important as Andy, but you know, I've met some cool people and had some cool things. So I would say one of the most exciting things that I've had is I've become friends with Stevie Wonder. And it's been really cool to kind of get to know him. I met him we were doing the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is obviously a big thing for this administration. And I worked a lot with the UN ambassador to the U.S., Susan Rice. And when we signed the convention in 2009, Susan Rice was actually the one who signed it because we signed it in New York, so the president announced it. Then we flew up to New York. I flew up to New York to Susan Rice actually signed it. So I had a chance to get to know her, and Stevie Wonder became a UN ambassador of peace, was appointed by, I think, I'm going to screw up the name, but anyway, he was appointed a UN ambassador of peace. And Susan Rice did an event for him, and it was just a really cool event. Like, it was one of those events where you were hanging out, and like Stevie Wonder was there, John Legend was there, Tom Brokaw was there, Katie Couric was there, Gayle King was there, and like I was standing around like, I'm definitely not supposed to be in this crowd. I mean, and like it was really cool because Stevie Wonder and John Legend just sat down at the piano and did like 5 songs each, and they did duets, and it was like 20 people. It was like a private concert. That's one of the coolest experiences for me. Forget all the policy stuff, man.
Fair enough.
So.
Fair enough. If I knew you had that in the pipeline.
Yeah.
Anybody want to try and top it?
It's pretty tough to follow that.
Yeah.
So, what, the flush story is not interesting enough for you? That felt like a big accomplishment. Really, and this was, I don't know any famous people except for Kareem and Andy. One of the most exciting, rewarding experiences, I think, involving my current job, we have these disability hiring fairs where we, invite folks that have submitted their resumes to us via, for Schedule A consideration, and we post the announcements and we invite people to come, and hiring managers for positions that we currently have open, and we've had lots of positions because of the Affordable Care Act in the last couple of years, and I had been very heavily involved in the organization of these job fairs. We also have regular, mainstream job fairs where we invite candidates with disabilities to come and interview on the spot. Many of them receive offers on the spot. So it was probably 2 weeks into my employment with my current federal agency when the first job fair happened, and I had all this work to do involving it, and I met this very lovely young woman who happened to be a candidate with a disability. And she was so very interested in finding a job, and it didn't work out for her that job fair, but she came to, I want to say 3 or 4 job fairs until she was hired, and she did get a position. And then maybe a year later, I went down to another of those job fairs, and there she was sitting as one of the hiring managers. And that, for me, that was one of the best, the happiest moments, I think, of my career, frankly, because here's somebody who was sitting on the other side of the table so very deeply wanting a job, doing everything in her power to try to get one, and she would have been an asset anywhere in the federal government. And it took her a little while, but then she found the job that really she loved. And a few short months later, there she was helping other people who had been in her same position and finding jobs. So that just was very meaningful to me.
Thank you. I think Kareem has the best story. the part of my work that I've always enjoyed the most is just cultivating kind of up-and-coming leaders with disabilities. And one positive experience I had was with Amelia, who's here. We had an opportunity for the 20th anniversary of the ADA to go on the news hour, the PBS news hour, to just reflect on 20 years of the ADA. And Judy Woodruff, who's somebody that has a son with a disability and is definitely a friendly interviewer, she was asking me, is there somebody who's kind of opposed to the ADA who we could have go on with you and have a little debate about it 20 years later? And I said, well, why do you want to do that? Why not have somebody that grew up since the ADA passed and kind of can reflect on? And she liked that idea, so we suggested Amelia, who went on the show, and it was live national television. And I think Amelia was your first time in that context. And she was a pro and just did great. And it was fun doing it with her and having such a friendly interviewer. Rare that you have those kinds of opportunities, but that kind of thing gets me excited.
Great, and I know actually we have a link to that still on the NALSWD blog. We put that up years ago, so if you want video, it's a pretty good presentation. Dory.
Yeah, Ms. Othman, last year and a half ago, I went to a conference on lawyers with disabilities, which you know about at the American University of Washington College of Law. And they explained that there is a category which gets you a quick hire in the federal government with a disability, Schedule A or something. And however, they said that it's like kind of you get marked and it's a second or third class category or something. And can anything be done about that?
I'd first say I would disagree that you.
I'm just quoting.
I understand. And certainly there may be challenges out there in other areas. I don't work in every federal agency, and I haven't, so I don't know if there maybe are some that treat it differently than they should. The spirit of Schedule A is intended to promote the hiring of individuals with disabilities. And in my experience, both as an employee and somebody who's actually implementing Schedule A hiring, and as a candidate, because I have applied using Schedule A probably to hundreds of jobs. I haven't had very negative experiences. The reality is that the marred or the blemish or things along those lines that are put next to somebody's name who is hired via Schedule A ought not to happen, and the folks who are involved in the hiring should not have access to medical information. The actual manager who's going to be supervising the candidate, and there are protections in the law, frankly, if they do, or if an agency is administering the Schedule A hiring program inappropriately. I think OPM would certainly be very interested in hearing about that, as would each agency has a disability employment program manager and a selective placement coordinator. And they are the ones who are responsible for implementing Schedule A hiring. They are the ones who are responsible for managing the hiring process and ensuring that medical documentation or proof of disability is kept separate from the person's resume and application files that are forwarded to the hiring managers and selecting officials. And if that's not working, then that's certainly something that folks would need to know about that. I was hired using the Schedule A hiring authority. I was hired twice using it and once not, once competitively with the federal government. And, I frankly have done better in the positions and promotions with regard to awards than I have in the position that I was not hired using Schedule A, that I was hired competitively. And so I think everybody has a different experience, but the knowledge that you've been given is certainly something that I would be happy to talk with you about offline and put you in touch with some folks that may be able to deal with that. And if it's sort of a myth, if it's happened to a few people and it's been a myth that's been exacerbated, then that's something that we need to deal with federal government-wide, because it's supposed to be a positive tool to equalize the playing field, not to make it more difficult.
And let me give you a little bit of a broader perspective on that as well. What we're trying to do with Schedule A at the level of the president is really demonstrate that Schedule A is something to be applauded and to be utilized and to be proud of. So for anybody that says it's a mark, I would encourage you, number one, you can take a listen to the president's speech on the 20th anniversary of the ADA when he announced the signing of the executive order to make the federal government a model employer. He mentioned Schedule A. The executive order that he signed that day talked about improving the use of Schedule A. So you can start by telling anybody that thinks it's a negative mark or anybody that says it's a negative mark, well, the president doesn't think so. And so you can pass that along as number one. Number two, in the use of the executive order, OPM has done a lot of videos to talk about how to better use Schedule A and how to better implement Schedule A. We put out, so on the OPM website, you'll see real quick videos, 5-minute videos on how Schedule A can be used, how it's important. So we're really, from a publicity standpoint or a public awareness standpoint, talking about how Schedule A can be used, should be used, and should not be viewed as a black mark. And then finally, maybe one of the biggest things that we're doing, we put out a proposed rule through OPM whereby there's this thing called the Certificate of Job Readiness that was put in place when Schedule A was adopted many years ago. And it was really put in place at a time when hiring of people with disabilities was thought of as a real sympathetic type issue, a pat on the head, or this poor disability person needs a job, and so we need some sort of certificate to say this person is capable of doing a job, which is really the stupidest thing I've ever heard of, right? And today it makes no sense that there needs to be this quote-unquote certificate of job readiness. But after all, what is somebody going to say? You are capable of doing the job. Like, that doesn't even make any sense. So we put out a rule for comment, and then we're going to work. I'm not sure if the comment period is closed. It may be closed. I haven't looked at the dates recently. But basically, it gets rid of this certificate of job readiness form, this requirement, because it makes no sense. And so we're going to change the mentality around Schedule A so that it's just about you still will need your, of course, proof of disability, your form to say you're a person with a disability, but you're not going to need this extra certificate of job readiness, which makes no sense anyway. And so those are the types of things that we're doing from the president on down to really say that Schedule A is something that as a government we should be using across the board for people with disabilities.
And I just want to add one other thing in terms of from the practical perspective with regard to Schedule A. Getting a job with the federal government takes a long time. It could take, in some cases, years if there's security clearance or whatnot involved, or if there's not, frankly, when you're applying competitively. Schedule A enables a federal agency to hire somebody. We've hired people who've come in for an interview at 9 o'clock. We've made an offer at 10 o'clock. Literally start within a couple of days. And so the practical aspects for expeditiousness really are huge. And the ADA and the Rehab Act, and by implication the ADA, really govern a lot with concerning Schedule A in terms of medical information. So the folks that would really be able to put a black mark on somebody who was hired via Schedule A couldn't really do that. The hiring managers, the folks that are often involved in promotion, they wouldn't know that the person was hired using Schedule A a lot of the time, because if HR is separate, HR is the one who's handling that process. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I'm just saying that there are mechanisms in place that protect it from happening, or that try to do that, and that they can, they can be improved certainly. But the federal agencies need to know that it's happening if that's the case. If Schedule A is getting this bum rep, then we need to really fix that. But we can't if we don't know why the bum rep. So where are these black marks being placed? Who's experiencing this? And what's happening? I mean, we get thousands of applications a year using Schedule A, and we hire as many of them as we can. I would say talk to people who do work for the federal government and get some anecdotal information to see if they feel like they've had some black marks placed on them because they've used Schedule A.
There's a question way in the back there.
All right, so I'm going to stand for this one.
Ronza mentioned that people in this room drive disability policy, but I want to hear from Kareem and Andy, and also Ronza, is how can people in this room continue to drive disability policy through OMB and through Congress in an election year when things are starting to grind to a halt?
I got a perfect answer for you for that one. We did is everybody familiar with the ARC organization? One of the largest organizations representing, working with, and of and with and by people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So we did this thing called Community Leaders Briefing Series a couple weeks ago, and so they brought in about 150 of their leaders from around the country, people with and without disabilities, their leaders, parents, self-advocates, etc. And we basically did a briefing with them where we had people from the Department of Justice, we had people from CMS, Department of Education, HUD, on and on and on, come in and speak to them and take questions and answers. And so one of the things that happened was a surprise drop-by visit by the president. Has anybody heard about this? Anybody heard about this? All right. You all should hear about this. You put it in I'm going to tell y'all how you all can hear about all this stuff so you can make sure. So
Friend Andy on Facebook.
get something to write down with. I'm going to tell you about that in a second. So the president did a surprise drop-by, and you can go check out his remarks on YouTube. His remarks on YouTube, his remarks on the White House website as well. But what he talked about in those remarks was that, listen, he talked about how the ARC was so pivotal, and so many people with disabilities were so pivotal last year during the budget fight when, frankly, members of the opposite party, Republican members, like the Ryan budget, were really trying to attack Medicaid and to make the budget cuts on the backs of people with disabilities. And what he said during his remarks were the fact that you all spoke up, the fact that people with disabilities spoke up, advocated, had Medicaid Matters rallies, that came to the White House and talked about the personal stories of how Medicaid helps people with disabilities be independent and be productive members of society. It's not just this program that allows people to sit at home, but it allows parents to work, it allows self-advocates to get the services that they need so that they can go out and work in integrated settings. And he talked about how those meetings and those rallies and those coming to tell their stories helped him as he was sitting across from Republicans in the debates and saying, we're not going to make the cuts to Medicaid and turn it into an unfunded block grant. And he encouraged the members of ARC, and we live streamed the event, so he was talking to everybody, and he encouraged everybody, keep doing that. Keep speaking out on policies that matter to people with disabilities. Keep talking to Andy. Keep talking to other members of Congress. Keep talking to us, and tell us why these things are important. Not just that you want them, but why they are important and how are they helping people with disabilities be productive, independent members of society and live in their communities where they choose. That's what's important. That's what helps us. So I'm going to tell you how you can learn about all this stuff. I have a distribution list where I send out information about this. You would have gotten this if you'd been on my distribution list. So I'm going to tell you can email us at, it's just the word disability, at who.eop, as in president.gov. So again, that's disability at who.eop.gov. And all you do is just say you want to be added to our distribution list. We'll add you, and we send out a lot of information. And if you ask for this specific link to the president's remarks, if you can't find it on YouTube, it was the ARC Community Leaders Briefing. It should be pretty easy to find on YouTube. You can see what the president said.
So Brett, thanks for that question. I think the key to me is there's a lot that is pending that it's unclear how it might happen before the election. A good example is this Section 503 proposed rule. It's a proposed rule. As Kareem said, and I completely agree with him, it could be one of the most significant policy developments affecting people with disabilities on the ground that we've had in the last 20 years. The business community, by and large, has been pretty negative about it. There was a negative article in the Wall Street Journal. There were a lot of negative comments filed with the Department of Labor. So this is a fight that we're in right now. And I think, law students with disabilities can play a role in the fight. I think, you know, the business community is arguing that it's bad for people with disabilities for them to have goals around hiring us. It kind of goes to Jory's point that somehow it's going to stigmatize us. And the reality is that they have goals for other populations. When the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Program does an audit of Lockheed Martin, they ask them how many women are in senior management, how many African Americans are in high mobility positions. I mean, they ask them very specific questions and they get specific answers. And historically, they haven't asked anything around disability other than maybe do you post jobs with the Vocational Rehabilitation Agency without even asking if they hired anybody. So to me, this is a big fight. It's not necessarily as high profile as a piece of legislation. But if we win this fight and we get a strong rule before the election, no matter what happens in the election, that's going to be a hard thing to undo. So that's one that I would just point to that we could really use help on, and certainly Senator Harkin is going to do what we can on our side to push it. The other thing I would just say, Brett, is having an impact in policy is really about relationships, and elections are a good time to build relationships. You know, Kareem met a lot of people in the context of the Obama campaign, and those relationships continue to this day. So this is a good time for folks to get involved in campaigns at the state level, local level, national level, build relationships, and try to leverage those relationships, you know, over time. And I really do think an election season is an ideal time to do that. There aren't as many layers between elected officials and people working for them in an election as there are sometimes once they're elected.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on what Andy said about Section 503, the comment period is closed, but things that you can be doing, Andy is right. I mean, I get news reports about anything related to disability every day, and I'm starting to see a lot of articles. There was one Daily Beast. There have been several negative articles about piggybacking off of that Wall Street Journal article that was so negative. So we need more positive publicity. You know, organizations like yours can write letters to the editor. You can do op-eds. You can hold meetings with corporations. And I mean, you can do a lot of things to push this. This is like Andy said, it may not get as much press because it's not legislation, but it's going to be a huge fight. It's a fight that the Department of Labor is ready for. I'm ready for at the White House. We're going to push really hard, but we need positive stories out there. We need positivity out there. And you all have megaphones across the country, and you've got to use them. You've got to get involved because you're going to benefit from it. And if you don't get involved and it doesn't happen, then you've got nobody else to blame except yourself.
Thank you. And I'm just going to bring that down one more level. How many of you guys, while you were on the plane, or while you were on if you were taking the metro, or just crossing a street, somebody struck up a conversation with you randomly? Maybe if you have an obvious disability, they were trying to be extra helpful, or they were, you know, they tried to engage you in some way, shape, or form. Those are perfect opportunities to change someone's mind. When you strike up that conversation, you know, talk about whatever it is. Everybody in this room cares about something. You wouldn't have spent your money, you wouldn't have, you know, spent your weekend here if you didn't care about something that you thought connected to this organization or somebody who's on one of these panels today and tomorrow. Figure out what that is that you care about and do some research. There is a group of other people out there that care about the same thing that you do, and they've probably been involved in shaping some of those policies and changing some of those people's minds in a more strategic way than the sidewalk conversation that you had with the person who was directing you on whether you should take the orange line or the blue line. That conversation right there is huge. One person's mind, you don't know who that person is. That person might share the office right next to Kareem, and they might have a very influential role. Or they might be a senior staffer in the congressman's office or the senator's office that is vehemently opposing what Andy and his office are trying to do right now. And you can change their minds with, you know, very short conversations. Just bring it down to the human level. Or get hooked up with an organization that actually is involved, has done some of this work. Because I guarantee you, if you care about something, there's a group out there that cares about it too and is involved in working to shape those policies around those issues.
Great. I think we have time for one last question.
I have a point of information.
I think you can talk to the
This
panelists.
long, no, it's about Stevie Wonder.
Okay. Well, it's about Steve.
He is very involved and dedicated to technology and disability.
He is. And the Stevie Wonder, remember, the Stevie Wonder story is not, I mean, it's all fun, but everything has a purpose. And so Andy does the same thing, I'm sure. We both do it for each other. Either, I use Senator Harkin or he uses the White House, maybe interested in something to push things along. But Stevie Wonder does the same thing. When we were signing the 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act, really a landmark piece of technology legislation for people with disabilities, and I was pushing for us to do a big, huge signing ceremony because I knew the president wanted to do one, but it's hard to get stuff on this schedule. I enlisted the support of Stevie Wonder to say, hey, Stevie, I know you want to come down for this. And he said, yeah, I want to come down for this. It always helps to be able to tell people, hey, Stevie Wonder wants to come down for this big event. And people are like, oh, well, maybe we do need to do a big event. So, we had a big event. So you have to use your resources. It's not just, hanging out with Stevie is cool. But it's using that to leverage what you need to get done. So it's all about strategy. Right?
I know. So the NALSWD conference where I first met Andy years ago, I know you guys talked about getting politicians with disabilities. Are there any out there we should know about? People who are rising, people who might start pushing some of these things on the legislative level?
Well, I don't know if Jim Langevin has spoken to this group before, but Jim Langevin is the co-chair of the Bipartisan Disabilities Caucus in the House. He's a Democratic congressman from Rhode Island who uses a wheelchair and has really had his whole political career as a person with a disability. There are a number of members who, if they stay in office long enough, they acquire disabilities over time. The best example is Jesse Helms, who opposed the ADA and then rode around the Senate in his scooter, taking advantage of all of the accessibility features. I see Jim Langevin as what I'm hoping is a new generation of politicians who get elected as a person with a disability and incorporate it kind of into their identity. They use their personal story to connect with voters and to push an agenda. In the Congress, there's more folks that have family members, like Senator Harkin. His oldest brother, Frank, was deaf, and that's how he got engaged in disability early on, and then he has a nephew who's a quadriplegic. There are a number of parents. Kathy McMorris Rogers is the co-chair of the Disabilities Caucus with Jim Langevin. She's got a 3-year-old with Down syndrome. Congressman Harper from Mississippi has a kid with a disability, also intellectual disability. So does Pete Sessions from Texas, who may be the next chair of the Rules Committee, which is one of the most powerful committees in the House. And if you just look at the history of the ADA, I mean, our movement has done a good job of finding people that have connections, deep personal connections to disability and leveraging them. Bob Dole, Ted Kennedy, Tom Harkin, Dick Thornburg, a number of the folks that worked on the ADA were doing it in part based on their personal connections to the issue. But the bottom line is that I know there's folks here that are involved with trying to create and grow political action committees that could help get candidates elected with disabilities and candidates who are good on disability issues. We still have a lot of work to do as a movement if you compare what's going on around that for people with disabilities to what's going on for women candidates, LGBT candidates, other constituencies. We still have some work to do, and part of it is getting people to own their disability identity. I think one of the interesting things to me is when Bob Dole ran for president and when John McCain ran for president, they both had compelling disability stories, compelling track records of leadership on disability issues. They were both major players in the ADA. Neither one of them used it politically when they ran for president. And I think part of it was they didn't want to emphasize that they had personal connections to disability because they were applying for a job that you're supposed to be superhuman to be able to do well. So I agree. I think it was a mistake, but I also think it's a sign that we're not quite there yet. I'm going to be excited when we have somebody running for president who has a disability and sees it as a positive, as a way to connect with voters.
or when Sotomayor was being nominated and diabetes came up as a negative for holding this lifelong job.
Yeah, well, actually, the Sotomayor example is, I think, a really interesting one. When President Obama introduced her as his nominee, he talked about her story as a child with diabetes and wanting to be Nancy Drew and worrying about discrimination. And it was really a compelling part of her introduction. But when she came up to the Senate, she didn't get any disability questions. And the two people who've been nominated for the Supreme Court before her got a lot of disability questions. So it was almost like an affirmative decision has been made. We're going to stay away from disability with this candidate because she has a personal connection. It was kind of weird.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. You were a great panel, and hopefully you'll stick around for a few minutes if people want to come up with questions after the panel.